Most people think they know why the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. They picture a desperate wartime calculation. Japan was refusing to surrender. An invasion of the Japanese mainland would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, possibly more. The bomb was terrible, but it was necessary. It ended the war. It saved lives. It was the lesser evil. That's the story that's been told for 80 years. It's the story carved into the narrative of American moral authority. And it is, at best, dangerously incomplete. Because here's the problem. The historical evidence, much of it classified for decades and only released in the 1990s and 2000s, tells a profoundly different story. A story in which Japan was already trying to surrender before the first bomb fell. A story in which a group of the very scientists who built the weapon begged the government not to use it on a civilian population and were deliberately silenced. A story in which a $2 billion secret project had developed its own institutional momentum so powerful that not using the bomb had become politically unthinkable, regardless of whether it was militarily necessary. A story in which the real target was not the Japanese military, but a man sitting in the Kremlin, and the real purpose was not to end the Second World War, but to establish dominance in the one that was about to begin. The decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not a simple military calculation. It was the product of institutional pressure, political survival, suppressed dissent, and cold geopolitical strategy, wrapped in the language of wartime necessity. And the human cost of that decision, a cost that is still being paid today in cancers, birth defects, and the perpetual shadow of nuclear annihilation, is the direct consequence of choices made not by soldiers on a battlefield, but by politicians, generals, and bureaucrats in rooms where the people who would die had no voice. And the most unsettling part of this story is that several of the most senior military commanders in the United States, including Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, believed the bomb was unnecessary. They said so, and they were ignored. So let's go back not to August of 1945, but to an afternoon in London in September of 1933, when a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard was waiting to cross a street near the British Museum. Szilard had recently fled Nazi Germany. He was thinking about an article by the physicist Ernest Rutherford, who had dismissed the idea of extracting usable energy from atomic nuclei as moonshine, and as the traffic light changed, Szilard had a flash of insight that would alter the course of human history. He conceived of the nuclear chain reaction, the idea that a neutron striking an atom could release additional neutrons which would strike other atoms, releasing still more, in an exponentially growing cascade of energy. Within months, Szilard had filed a patent on the concept and, recognizing its military implications, had attempted to keep it secret. He failed. By 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had achieved nuclear fission in a Berlin laboratory, and the news spread through the global physics community like a shockwave. For scientists who understood the implications, the meaning was terrifying. If fission could be harnessed, it could produce a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. And Nazi Germany, which had just annexed Austria and was preparing to invade Czechoslovakia, had a head start. This fear, the fear that Hitler would get the bomb first, is the reason the Manhattan Project was born. In August of 1939, Szilard drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning that recent developments in nuclear physics could lead to the construction of extremely powerful bombs. He persuaded Albert Einstein to sign it. The letter reached Roosevelt in October, and within months, the American nuclear weapons program was underway. But here is where the story most people know diverges from the story the evidence actually tells. Because the premise that launched the entire project, the fear that Germany was building a nuclear weapon, turned out to be wrong. And the people running the project knew it was wrong years before the bomb was used. By the middle of 1944, intelligence was already suggesting that Germany's nuclear program was nowhere close to producing a weapon. The ALSO's mission, a secret intelligence operation that followed Allied forces into Europe specifically to assess the state of German nuclear research, began capturing German scientists and seizing laboratory equipment in late 1944 and early 1945. What they found was startling. Germany's nuclear program was fragmented, underfunded, and years behind the Manhattan Project. Werner Heisenberg, the theoretical physicist leading the German effort, had made fundamental miscalculations about the amount of fissile material needed for a weapon. The German program had never progressed beyond small-scale reactor experiments. There was no German bomb. There had never been a realistic prospect of a German bomb. And by December of 1944, the leadership of the Manhattan Project knew this with certainty. The original justification for building the weapon had evaporated. But the project did not slow down. It accelerated. And the reason it accelerated had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with institutional momentum. The Manhattan Project had become the largest and most expensive secret enterprise in human history. Over 125,000 people were working across dozens of secret facilities. Entire cities had been built from scratch. Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington State, Los Alamos in New Mexico, cities that appeared on no map and whose residents were forbidden from telling even their families where they lived or what they did. The project had consumed approximately $2 billion, roughly $30 billion in today's terms. It was managed by General Leslie Groves, a military engineer who had previously overseen the construction of the Pentagon and who understood with perfect clarity that a $2 billion secret project that produced no usable result would be a political catastrophe. Groves later stated explicitly that one of the primary reasons the bomb had to be used was to justify its enormous cost. Congress had appropriated the money in secret, without the knowledge of most of its own members. If the war ended without the bomb being dropped, there would be investigations. There would be hearings, careers would be destroyed. The bomb had become an institutional necessity. The question was no longer whether to use it, the question was where. Now, here is the second thing that most conventional histories either minimize or omit entirely. By the summer of 1945, Japan was already a defeated nation. This is not revisionist speculation. It is the conclusion reached by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a comprehensive official assessment conducted immediately after the war. The survey concluded that Japan would have surrendered even without the atomic bombs, even without the Soviet entry into the war, and even without a planned invasion, in all probability prior to the end of 1945. The military reality on the ground supports that assessment completely. By mid-1945, the Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist. Its merchant fleet had been decimated by American submarines, which had sunk roughly 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. Oil imports had been cut by over 90%. The American naval blockade had severed Japan from virtually all external resources. The home islands were being subjected to a relentless conventional bombing campaign under General Curtis LeMay that had already destroyed vast sections of Japan's major cities. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, a single firebombing raid on Tokyo killed over 100,000 people, injured roughly 1 million more, and left 1 million homeless. More people died in that single night than in the immediate aftermath of either atomic bomb. LeMay himself would later say that if the United States had lost the war, he expected to be tried as a war criminal. By July of 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been firebombed. The country's industrial capacity had been shattered. Its civilian population was starving. And critically, Japan's leadership was already seeking a path to surrender. This is where the classified intelligence record becomes devastating. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, the United States was intercepting and decoding Japanese diplomatic communications through a signals intelligence program codenamed MAGIC. These intercepts revealed that the Japanese foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, had instructed Ambassador Naotake Sato in Moscow to approach the Soviet Union about mediating a peace settlement. The intercepts showed that significant elements of the Japanese government, including the emperor himself, were seeking an end to the war. Don't be afraid to go out on a limb. That's where the fruit is. There was one primary obstacle. The Japanese leadership wanted assurance that the emperor would not be deposed, tried as a war criminal, or executed. This was not a demand for unconditional victory. It was a request to preserve the symbolic head of state, a figure who held deep cultural and religious significance for the Japanese people. The Potsdam Declaration, issued by the Allies on July 26, 1945, demanded Japan's unconditional surrender but said nothing about the emperor's status. This omission was deliberate. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and several senior State Department officials had recommended including a guarantee for the emperor, arguing that it would accelerate Japan's surrender. Secretary of State James Burns opposed the guarantee, in part because he believed it would appear politically weak, and in part because he wanted to use the atomic bomb before the war ended. And here is the fact that demolishes the standard narrative entirely. After both atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered, the United States allowed Emperor Hirohito to remain on the throne. The one condition Japan had been seeking was ultimately granted. The question that history has never adequately answered is why it was not granted before Hiroshima, when doing so might have ended the war without the bomb. The most uncomfortable answer, supported by diaries, memos, and declassified documents, is that key decision-makers did not want the war to end before the bomb could be used. And this brings us to the scientists, the people who actually built the weapon, and what they tried to do when they realized how it was going to be used. In June of 1945, a group of 7 Manhattan Project scientists, led by the Nobel laureate James Franck, submitted a report to the Secretary of War. The Franck Report warned that using the atomic bomb on a Japanese city without prior warning or demonstration would be a grave moral error and would undermine America's position in the post-war world. The report recommended a demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited area, witnessed by representatives of the United Nations, before any use against a civilian population. The committee argued that a surprise nuclear attack on a city would shatter international trust, trigger a nuclear arms race, and make future arms control negotiations far more difficult. They were right on every count. Separately, Leo Szilard, the physicist whose chain reaction insight had started the entire enterprise, circulated a petition among Manhattan Project scientists urging the president not to use the bomb against Japan without first offering surrender terms and demonstrating the weapon's power. 70 scientists signed the petition. It was dated July 17, 1945, the day after the Trinity test had successfully detonated the first nuclear device in the New Mexico desert. General Groves intercepted the petition. He classified it as secret, routed it through military channels designed to delay its delivery, and ensured that it never reached President Truman before the decision to use the bomb was finalized. The scientists who built the weapon were systematically prevented from influencing the decision about how it would be used. Their expertise was essential for construction but inconvenient for policy. Now, if the suppression of scientific dissent is troubling, the geopolitical dimension of the decision is the thread that ties everything together, and it has nothing to do with Japan. It has to do with the Soviet Union. In July of 1945, President Harry Truman traveled to Potsdam, Germany, for a conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to discuss the post-war order in Europe and the terms for ending the war in the Pacific. The Trinity test took place on July 16th, while Truman was en route. When the results reached him, multiple witnesses described a visible change in Truman's demeanor. Churchill noted that Truman was suddenly more assertive, more confident, more willing to confront Stalin on disputed issues. On July 24th, Truman casually informed Stalin that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, who already knew about the Manhattan Project through Soviet espionage, responded with studied indifference. But the message had been delivered. Secretary of State James Burns was explicit about the bomb's geopolitical purpose. He stated that the bomb would put the United States in a position to dictate terms at the end of the war and would, in his words, make Russia more manageable in Europe. Burns was not talking about Japan. He was talking about the post-war balance of power. He was talking about Eastern Europe, about Germany, about spheres of influence. The bomb was a diplomatic weapon aimed at Moscow, and using it on a Japanese city was the demonstration that would make the threat credible. This interpretation is not the product of Cold War revisionism. It is supported by Truman's own diary entries, by Burns's recorded statements, by Stimson's private journals, and by the timing of events. The Soviet Union had agreed at the Yalta Conference to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany surrendered on May 8th. 3 months later was August 8th. The Soviets declared war on Japan on August 8th, exactly on schedule, 2 days after Hiroshima and 1 day before Nagasaki. Historians like Tsuyoshi Hasegawa have argued, with substantial documentary evidence, that it was the Soviet declaration of war, not the atomic bombs, that ultimately broke the deadlock within Japan's Supreme War Council and led to the decision to surrender. The Emperor's intervention on August 10th, in which he told the Council that the war must be ended, came after the Soviet invasion of Manchuria had destroyed Japan's last strategic hope, the possibility of using the Soviet Union as a neutral mediator. If the Soviet entry into the war was the decisive factor, then the atomic bombs were not the instrument that ended the conflict. They were a geopolitical signal fired at the cost of 2 Japanese cities. Now let me bring all of these threads together, because the true horror of the decision to use the atomic bomb is not any single factor. It is the way institutional momentum, political calculation, suppressed dissent, and geopolitical ambition converged to produce an outcome that many of the most informed people in the American government and military believed was unnecessary. You had the original justification for building the bomb, the fear of a German nuclear weapon, collapse 18 months before the bomb was used. You had a $2 billion secret project, with its own bureaucratic survival instinct, led by a general who explicitly stated the bomb needed to be used to justify its cost. You had a Japan that was militarily destroyed, economically strangled, and actively seeking surrender through diplomatic channels that the United States was intercepting and reading in real time. You had a surrender condition, the preservation of the emperor, that was ultimately granted after the bombs were dropped, meaning it could have been granted before. You had the scientist who built the weapon formally warning against its use on civilians and being systematically silenced. And you had a president and secretary of state who viewed the bomb not as a tool for ending the war with Japan, but as a lever for managing the Soviet Union in the post-war world. Each of these factors alone casts serious doubt on the standard narrative. Together, they present a picture that is far more troubling than any simple military calculation. The human cost of this convergence is staggering. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on the city of Hiroshima. In the first seconds, the blast and thermal radiation killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people. Tens of thousands more suffered burns, radiation sickness, and traumatic injuries. By the end of 1945, the death toll in Hiroshima had reached approximately 140,000. 3 days later, on August 9th, a plutonium bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The original target that morning had been the city of Kokura, but cloud cover forced the bomber to divert to its secondary target. Approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly in Nagasaki. The total death toll by the end of 1945 reached roughly 70,000. In the years and decades that followed, the radiation effects continued. Survivors, known in Japanese as hibakusha, suffered elevated rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, and other malignancies. Children exposed in utero were born with developmental disabilities. Birth defects appeared in subsequent generations. And the American government's initial response was not treatment, it was study. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1947 under the direction of the National Academy of Sciences, systematically tracked and examined survivors for decades, collecting invaluable data on the long-term effects of radiation exposure. But for years, it provided no medical treatment to the people it was studying. The hibakusha were research subjects, not patients. They were observed, measured, and cataloged, while many of them struggled to access basic medical care. In Japanese society, hibakusha faced profound stigma. They were feared as contaminated, discriminated against in employment and marriage, and often lived in poverty and isolation. The bomb did not just destroy 2 cities, it created a permanent underclass of survivors whose suffering was compounded by social exclusion and, for decades, by institutional indifference from the country that had inflicted their wounds. And then came the consequence that the Franck Report had predicted with chilling accuracy: the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in August of 1949, 4 years after Hiroshima. The United States responded by developing the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful. The Soviets followed. Within 2 decades, the world's nuclear arsenals contained enough destructive power to end human civilization several times over. At the peak of the Cold War, the combined global stockpile exceeded 70,000 nuclear warheads. The logic of deterrence, the doctrine that nuclear war could be prevented by ensuring that any first strike would be met with annihilating retaliation, became the foundation of international security. It was a system that worked, until it didn't. And it almost didn't work on multiple occasions. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Able Archer exercise of 1983, the numerous false alarms triggered by malfunctioning early warning systems, any one of these incidents could have ended in the extinction of hundreds of millions of people. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just the end of the Second World War, they were the beginning of an era in which the survival of the human species became a matter of institutional discipline, diplomatic restraint, and, more often than anyone is comfortable admitting, pure luck. What historians get wrong about the atomic bomb, time and again, is treating the decision as a straightforward military necessity, a grim but rational calculation that saved more lives than it took. That framing is not just incomplete. It requires ignoring the documentary record, the intelligence assessments, the internal dissent, the geopolitical motivations, and the post-war conclusions of the American government's own strategic surveys. The real story is that the bomb was used because the institutional, political, and geopolitical pressures to use it were overwhelming, and the people who could have stopped it were either overruled or silenced. And the parallels with our own time are not abstract. there are still approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads in the world today. 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. The arms control treaties that were painstakingly negotiated over decades are being abandoned or allowed to expire. The risk of nuclear conflict, whether through deliberate escalation, miscalculation, or accident, is assessed by many security experts to be higher now than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The logic of deterrence still holds, but it holds on assumptions about rational decision-making and institutional restraint that the history of the atomic bomb itself calls into question. This is why understanding the true origins of the decision to use nuclear weapons matters, not as an exercise in second-guessing the past, but as a warning about the future. Because the forces that drove that decision, institutional momentum, political pressure, suppressed expertise, the conflation of geopolitical strategy with military necessity, are not relics of 1945. They are permanent features of how powerful nations make decisions about war and peace. The conventional story of the atomic bomb is a comforting one in a way. It tells us that terrible weapons were used for a good reason, that the destruction was justified by the lives it saved, and that the people who made the decision were acting under impossible circumstances with the best available information. But the real story is far less reassuring. The real story is that the decision was shaped by forces that had nothing to do with saving lives, that the people who knew the most about the weapon and its consequences were deliberately excluded from the decision, and that the primary beneficiary of the bombing was not the American soldier who would no longer have to invade Japan, but a geopolitical strategy aimed at a country that was technically still an ally. They weren't evil, they were caught in a machine of their own creation, a machine of secrecy, expense, institutional survival, and geopolitical ambition that had grown too large and too powerful for any single person to stop. And the most dangerous lesson of all is this. Once a weapon exists, the political, institutional, and psychological pressures to use it are almost irresistible. That was true in 1945. It remains true today. And the 12,000 warheads still sitting in silos and on submarines across the world are a reminder that the decision made in the summer of 1945 was not a conclusion, it was a beginning. If this story changed the way you think about how the most consequential decisions in history are actually made, take a moment and hit that subscribe button. We go deep on the forces that actually move markets, nations, and the global order. The kind of stories that don't make the evening news but quietly shape the world you live in. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Was the bomb a military necessity, a political inevitability, or something else entirely? I'd love to hear your take. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about understanding how power actually works. I'll see you in the next one.